Welcome back to another Edgy Podcaster podcast episode. As we are meeting our third expert. Now, if you want to connect with Tim and myself, Victoria, feel free to do that on edgypodcaster.com. Today, our third expert in our series about learning about the oceans, we get to talk to Rachel. And this will be a fascinating episode. Tim, can you tell us more about Rachel and tell us a little bit about her background?
Well, I first got to know Rachel through my work with Plastic Oceans Canada, and Rachel has become a spokesperson for us and an educator. She lives over on Vancouver Island in the small town of Hewlett, born and raised over there, and so a true ocean spirit, this girl, very, very knowledgeable, having grown up on the shores of the Pacific Ocean and having now studied it. And she's also an educator with Parks Canada. So she's a very, very good communicator and very knowledgeable. In this particular episode, she's going to speak on all kinds of things related to the west coast of the island and the intertidal zone. And you're going to learn all kinds of very cool things, and will make your next visit to the ocean that much more enjoyable because you'll know what it is you're looking at.
Fantastic. And it sounds to me that we are ready to go. So as we enter into our first bit of our interview with Rachel, we're going to learn a little bit about mussels and sea otters. And we're going to actually listen to her talk a little bit about a virus that is affecting sea stars. So students out there, kids that are listening, take some time to think about sea stars. Think about when was the last time you saw a sea star. And if you're not around oceans, then take some time to Google an image of a sea star on the west coast of British Columbia before you go on to this first clip. Tim, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, she speaks about the sea star wasting virus. Think about how that relates to what we've been experiencing in this current conditions of this pandemic. Animals as well are affected by viruses that they're unable to defend themselves from. And it's been very evident in the sea star population.
Awesome. Well, without further ado, here is Rachel.
The mussels are mollusks, so they belong to this group with oysters and clams, and mussels they're delicious. If you go to a restaurant, that's something that you'll likely find. And we have noticed on the coast, there's a theory that mussels were one of the foods that sea otters ate. Sea otters, really interesting little critter, and just enormous appetite in order to stay warm. So they ate tons of shellfish. And in the absence of the sea otter, there's some thought that the mussels actually grew to be bigger than they would otherwise, because you can find some just huge mussels. And our sea star population, sadly, has really suffered in the last few years from this virus called sea star wasting syndrome. And the research is a little unclear on what exactly happened, but the population of sea stars was just really decimated, and we are beginning to see a recovery. So there is some positive movement there. But they also, sea stars, many of them, particularly the ochre stars, which are the sort of pink and purple and orange ones you see fly in the intertidal zone, they eat mussels as well. So the mussels have been without their main sort of predators for the last few years.
Well, as Rachel has talked about the sea star wasting virus, I think these are very interesting words that she shared with us. And perhaps these might echo more about our current situation with our pandemic and how we are all connected together. Tim, is there anything that you wanted to say about the sea star wasting virus?
Well, the word is that there's a strong recovery going on right now. So as mysteriously as it arrived, it seems to be something that they've worked themselves through. But it's taken a number of years. And but the good news is there is a seeming recovery. And now if you do find yourself on the coast, you will see these beautiful orange-colored and purple-colored sea stars clinging to the rocks in the intertidal zone. And so that is good news that they seem to have recovered.
And it looks to me that when we talk about sea otters on the west coast of Vancouver, that there has been some issues with the numbers of sea otters. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, Tim?
Well, yeah, listen to what Rachel has to say about it. Interesting facts about the content of like, for instance, otters don't have any fat in their tissue to keep them warm. So they do so using a very interesting design fur. The problem for the sea otter, of course, as you'll come to find out, is that fur became very desirable among Europeans as they explored and found themselves on the west coast of North America. And that really ended up bringing about the demise of the sea otter, but it has been recovered. And Rachel is going to explain to us how that came about.
Sea otters are one of my favorite topics because they're really an example of how much influence humans have on our ecosystem and how we can really be a force for positive or for ill. So sea otters ended up becoming really all the rage in Europe for cats. So sea otters are really unique in their life history. They're the only marine mammal with no layer of blubber. So they have this phenomenal coat to keep them warm. And in Europe, for a period there, hats were really the thing out of fur. So the sea otter it was known as sort of the soft gold rush, and early colonization on the coast and interactions between Europeans and the First Nations people here were really driven by the trade in the sea otter, and they were hunted to the point where they were extirpated. So there were none along the coast of Vancouver Island. And there's just such an important piece of the ecosystem. They're a keystone species, so they really are a builder and a shaper of the underwater ecosystem. Because they eat these creatures called sea urchins, and sea urchins are vegetarian. They eat kelp. And kelp forests are, we have forests on land. Kelp forests are the underwater forests, and they are home and food to all sorts of important things. So sea urchins, when they lost their predator, they effectively clear cut the sea floor, and they create these urchin barrens, which basically look like the surface of the moon. There's nothing living there. So it was decided that this was a problem and that it could be done. So a group of Canadians went to the Americans and said, please, could we have some sea otters? Because there were sea otter colonies up in Alaska as well as down in California. And for a whole host of reasons, the government said, yes, you can have some sea otters. So it was complicated. Anytime you're trying to translocate an animal, it's challenging. But a few groups were reintroduced off the northern coast of Vancouver Island, and they are slowly making their way south. So when I was little, growing up here, sea otters were unheard of. You would never see them. And now, if you get in a boat and go north of Tofino, 9 times out of 10, you can find sea otters, which is exciting. They're really doing well. And as they're reintroduced, they're really quite rapidly, they're consuming those urchins, and they're reestablishing kelp forests, which is really exciting because kelp forests are so significant.
Sea otters. Who knew that this sea otter population has fluctuated so much off the west coast of Canada? You think about how just one particular species or one particular animal, such as the sea otter, can actually have drastic impacts on the local environment. It reminds me of a video called How the Wolves Changed the Rivers, or How the Rivers Changed because of the wolves. It's a Yellowstone YouTube video. And for the listeners right now, if you want to put pause on this podcast and go and Google that, How the Wolves Changed the Rivers, you can watch a video about how the wolves in Yellowstone, they were brought in and they changed the direction and the ways of the rivers, and in turn actually changed the environment and the ecosystem and the way the predators and the prey interacted with each other. Is absolutely fascinating. And as we listened to Rachel about the sea otters, I think the exact same happened. Tim?
Yeah, well, we'll link in our edupodcaster.com website to that video, and it is a direct parallel. It's happened in many instances over the interaction over the years between as animals and humans have interacted, and as humans expanded their territory, they're naturally going to infringe upon the natural territories of the animals, and there's going to be conflict, and sometimes the conflict is negative and sometimes it's positive. Yeah, coming up in the next clip with Rachel, she's going to be talking about the gray whales. And if you ever have an opportunity to be over on the west coast of the Vancouver Island and have a chance to look way out on the sort of the horizon, well offshore, you may see the blowhole of gray whale. This is somewhat as opposed to interior, for instance, in the Salish Sea between Vancouver Island and the mainland, you'll see orcas and you'll see humpbacks. These massive marine animals sort of have picked their territories. We have the northern residents up at the top end of the island, and the southern residents more down here and closer to Vancouver, and then the transients, which seem to migrate great distances from Alaska right down to Mexico, whereas the northern and southern residents don't really move. The gray whales are the ones you'll see off the coast, right out in the open Pacific Ocean. And this will be the first time that Rachel speaks of the Nuchalmanoth, which is the First Nations population traditionally on the territories of the west coast of Vancouver Island. And she speaks about the relationship that they had to the gray whale.
Well, let's turn now to Rachel to listen to her talk about the gray whales.
They come around March is when they start to show up. And every year, they're on their way further north. They're beautiful animals, and if you spend time on the beach, you can see them from the beach quite regularly. You can watch for their blows, and they're feeding. The gray whales have baleen, so it's like having a comb in your mouth. Mm-hmm. It's like teeth, and they take great big bites of the sediment in the bottom, and then with their tongue they squish that through the baleen, and the baleen catches all the little critters that live in the seafloor, and that's how they're feeding. So you can watch them feeding, and you can stand up on rocks occasionally if you're fortunate and look right down and observe their behavior. So they're really an incredible species, and they're one of I know there's a recent paper that's come out that's suggesting that their populations are recovering, as they were one of those species that was hunted and really not well understood for a long time on our coast, and really hunted to the point at which they were quite threatened. And the Nuchalmanoth, which are the First Nations that are in the area, they have a long and really deep legacy and relationship with the whales on their coast, and engaged in some hunting as part of their subsistence, and have some really beautiful stories about their connection with lots of aspects of nature in this place here, but also stories about the whales.
The gray whales play such a significant role with the relationship of the Indigenous people. And Rachel talks so much about the beauty of these animals, and I encourage our listeners to take some time to do some research on the gray whales. wherever you're listening, whether it's in Europe or Asia or Africa or North America, take some time to learn about these magnificent creatures that are found on the west coast of BC. We are going to be switching gears here and learning a little bit about the mole crab. Yes, the mole crab. I actually hadn't even heard of the mole crab before I had connected with Rachel and her interesting research on the mole crab.
Yeah, sort of like when she mentioned about how the gray whale takes big gulps of the ocean floor and just sifts through the sand and the muck to find its food. That's something also I didn't know prior to listening. So that was a pretty interesting method of feeding. But I had asked Rachel about climate change and how it might be affecting the coast and the organisms that live in this region in the intertidal zones and just offshore. And take note of the way she responds, saying that adaptations can be very interesting, and bringing new species into an environment isn't necessarily a bad thing. It might be, but it might not be. But what every scientist seems to find most alarming is the rate of change, the things that they're seeing that are different are happening so quickly, and this is something that we've never seen in the past. So it's clear evidence that climate change is a real thing.
Okay, well, with that being said, let's move on and move back to listening to Rachel.
You come down to the beach on the west coast now, you can find in the sand these little crabs called mole crabs. And if you look in a guidebook, it'll tell you that, every now and then in a year where we had, a particular circulation happening up the coast from California, and it was particularly warm, you might see a mole crab, but they wouldn't last the winter, and they certainly don't breed on the coast. However, now you find them here regularly, and it is looking like they're breeding here, which is sort of new. So we're seeing these shifts, and it's shifts in nature are part of the process, but the speed at which things are changing is a little alarming, and scientists are sort of running to keep up.
Interesting. And as soon as you bring in a new organism that actually can now breed, you introduce a whole new food supply upline and downline that could upset the entire ecosystem.
The potential is there. Not every invasive species ends up being really damaging. Some aren't successful enough to really, they might exploit a niche or an area of habitat that's different. Some of them manage to sort of form those relationships and learn how to play nice. But some really can be, really, really damaging and cause problems, as they haven't built those relationships within the ecosystem that keep, each species sort of in balance with the next. So it is, those questions are being asked, and we just, things we just don't have the answers to yet.
Well, it's good that we're asking those questions, and it's also good news that you're bringing in that not every invasive species is necessarily a bad intruder. They may learn to play nice, as you say.
Wow, that was really fascinating about what she talked about with the mole crab. And it's really interesting to think about how when we introduce new species, that perhaps that may not always be a good thing, but perhaps it might be. I mean, that's the risk that you're taking when you're putting in a new species or a new type of animal into a different environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in this next clip, I had asked Rachel about the salmon forest. And the salmon forest is something that it sounds unusual because salmon don't live in the forest. But for centuries, the animals, bears, wolves, otters, have been dragging the salmon from the rivers, the creeks, and the ocean, and eating them at the base of the trees. And of course, they'll leave parts of the fish and left it there to decay, and this becomes part of the soil. And so there's a direct relationship between the ocean and the forest. It's not that the ocean ends where the forest starts and vice versa. There's actually a relationship between the two that's been going on for forever. And Rachel does a very nice job of explaining how we know that that's the case.
Really beautiful lumber on our forests is actually tied back to the richness of our oceans on this coast.
The salmon forest.
Yeah. So salmon begin their lives in streams, and then they go out into the ocean, and then they come back to their natal stream, and they bring all of that nutrients from the ocean back, and they are food for our bears and our wolves and our eagles.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bodies that are left, they are home for, they have insects breed in them, so our songbirds then benefit. And then, the last remnants that go into the banks, they cause those trees to grow bigger. And they've done studies, analysis of the isotopes, and they've got a marine signature in a lot of the nutrients in the trees.
That's just incredible that the trees have a marine signature in the isotopes. It's just a beautiful connection between the ocean and the forests, and
the link between the ocean and the forest is just so significant on our coast, and we're in ways that we're still struggling to understand and unravel how they're interconnected.
The salmon have been such an integral part of the west coast of British Columbia, and I think they will continue to be such an integral part. And often we think about salmon as just being fish that go back and forth from the rivers to the Pacific Ocean. But they're more than that. They've become part of the land too.
That's exactly correct. They have. And as we move into the next clip, I asked Rachel about this word that's become quite popular in terms of describing the era that we live in. Humans have such an impact on Earth, and the study of humans, the history of humanity, is called anthropology. And really what we've been living in for the last several 100,000 years is the Holocene era. Are we, though, now moving into the Anthropocene era, as in the era of the human, where we're having the greatest impact on the earth, more so than anything else? Rachel, being so insightful, says something that I really wasn't expecting, which was that humans have been beneficial in some ways, in many ways really, to the earth. We've been harmful, but we have been beneficial. And she challenges the notion that we're living in the Anthropocene, which was a really interesting comment, and first time I'd ever heard that perspective. So listen for that as we play her clip now.
Yeah, so if you talk to an earth and ocean scientist, there's a bit of a debate about the technicality of whether or not we can, distinctly call this the Anthropocene. Mm-hmm. I think it's a useful term when we think about the scale of change that humans are, rendering on the environment. But from what I have studied, and when you look at different cultures and different people around the world, humans can play a role in the environment that can be just phenomenally beneficial. You look at all around the planet, different communities who are doing amazing things to restore their natural environment and live in balance and really be, not just minimize their impact, but be beneficial so that, natural systems are more productive and healthier. So we have the capacity to really be a positive force for the natural environment. It's just how we set up our systems and how we sort of show up and engage with the world.
So far, Rachel has just shared with us so much information. I feel like I'm kind of drinking from a fire hydrant right now.
Yeah. Yeah, sort of true. She's a very knowledgeable scientist, advocate of the land and the oceans, and a great communicator. In this last clip, she again blows me away with a point that she makes about the wilderness. And if you've been camping, if you've pitched a tent somewhere in the woods, if you've hiked into the mountains or kayaked along the shores of the ocean, you say to yourself, I'm away from civilization and the populations of the cities. I must be in the wilderness. And then what she does here, and listen for this, where she describes, well, what really is wild? What's wild? What part of Canada or anywhere that you might call the wilderness has ever actually been untouched by humans? We think of it very much so from a colonial perspective, where we arrived and humans arrived in North America with the first explorers. But what really is wilderness? And she again refers back to the Nuu people and their description of trees. And it's a beautiful description of what a tree really is. So listen for that. And this is a perspective I'm sure will be new, but it's a very beautiful perspective.
Yeah, when we talk about the concept of wilderness, what does it mean for a place to be wild? We really have this concept of it being absent of human presence, this idea that it's untouched.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really start to dig into humanity's history with the natural environment, to have a place be wild doesn't necessarily mean that it is absent of humans. If you look at in our country the legacy of First Nations and the work that a lot of their communities continue to do, they interact with the natural world in a way that increases the productivity and is really beneficial and productive, and they're living in this relationship that
and have for thousands of years.
Yes, for time immemorial. So that relationship is beneficial, and those areas are still wild. They're just not untouched in the way we sort of frame wild spaces today. On the coast, the Nuu word for tree is the thing which holds the earth in place. So that sort of shift in perspective now, when we're talking about forests and forestry and logging, you're not cutting timber down, you're cutting the thing which holds the earth in place down. And that doesn't mean we don't need forestry and logging. That's an important industry, but it forces us to think about, well, how can we do that in a way that is still respectful and still ensures that it is in alignment and balance with the needs of humans and nature.
She refers to trees as the thing which holds the earth. Or that's what the Nuu people call the tree.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So when you cut down the trees, you're cutting down the thing that holds the earth.
Yeah, man. Can you imagine if our education system was revamped to be attuned to the Indigenous perspectives of life? Like how that would change and revolutionize our classrooms?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think that's the goal, isn't it? Like, certainly as part of the goal of the truth and reconciliation and the whole First Nations perspective. Everything you teach is supposed to be a First Nations perspective. Yeah. So I think that is the goal.
Well, Tim, I would have to say that was just an absolutely amazing episode. The stuff that we've just learned from Rachel, I think will simmer with me for weeks and months to come.
Rachel is really a young person who's studying the ocean and the relationship of the people with the land. And it goes to show you that wisdom doesn't need to be reliant upon age. Rachel's not old in years, but she's wise, like a person who's old in years. And I really appreciate that about her.
Yeah, I think that term old spirit, or just kind of like wise beyond her years, are probably terms that would be
Yeah.
applicable for her. Just being able to be insightful and being so in touch with nature, and to be able to glean that knowledge of being connected with the earth and with nature so much that you can bring it into your real life. And it sounds like she's really done a wonderful job at weaving research in with her love of nature. And it's very powerful when we have an opportunity to be able to bring our podcast to a global audience and be able to listen to her. So I guess we're wrapping up the series. This has been an amazing adventure from we had our trailer, and then we had our intro episode, and then now we've had our 3 experts. And I think just ending this episode, we really want to encourage all our listeners to be able to take this wisdom, this knowledge, and this information and run with it. Maybe if you're listening to this right now, perhaps you might want to share some information about sea stars. Maybe you might want to share some information about the west coast of British Columbia, the gray whales. Maybe you want to share about the Salmon Forest. Maybe you want to participate in some climate change action projects that are going on right now. There's so much that you can do, and we are going to be posting some opportunities for you to connect with different people and different organizations to pursue and to learn more about how you save the oceans.
Yeah, and if you go to our website, you'll see links to some of these things you're referring to, but as well, as a follow-up, don't just listen to these podcasts, but as you're mentioning, Victoria, take action. So we've got a bunch of options listed on the website that you can now do as an activity, or some research, suggested books you could read, videos you can watch, and inquiry projects that you could get deeper into the knowledge with. So go down and have a look at those, and take part in constructing something that's going to take this knowledge that you've gained and ingrain it into your brain. And then I just can't wait for you to go for the first time over to the ocean and see with your own eyes these things that you've been learning about, and benefit from the connection you get when you know more about what you're looking at.
Well, Tim, I think we are done our series now, and we've challenged our listeners. I think it's time for us to wrap it up. And as Tim said, connect with us on edupodcaster.com. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast for all the latest episodes. We will be doing different series in the coming months. Please parachute in whenever you have a chance. Use them for your classroom, use them for your home, remote learning, in the building, or maybe just going for a walk in the neighborhood. So until next time, remember, this is EduPodcaster Podcast with Tim and Victoria. Remember to always listen and learn.